Well, today we're going to be talking about emotional intelligence. And what is this? It's understanding your emotions and the emotions of others and responding to those emotions how? In a healthy way. It sounds pretty simple, but it is involved. There are 5 components of emotional intelligence. The first one is knowing our emotions. This means to be able to not only identify precisely what we are feeling, but why we are feeling that way. And the why cannot be just due to what somebody said to me or what somebody did to me. Because if that's the why, you're not understanding your emotions. Your emotions are actually based on the thoughts that you have about what somebody said or did to you. And the thoughts, we really cannot begin to understand ourselves until we start to analyze our thoughts. And this is something that's very difficult for a lot of people. We have a lot of thoughts throughout the day. And in fact, studies show that you will have a minimum during your waking hours of 5 thoughts per minute. And it can be up to 12 or even more thoughts per minute. Hopefully you'll have more like the 12 thoughts per minute during this time, where you can engage and have your thoughts going in a direction that is going to help us. But 80% of individuals' thoughts today are negative. And 95% of those thoughts are repetitive. And when we do repetitive negative thoughts, it becomes a groove in the brain where it's just easy for things to go that direction. And so it's very important for us to know our emotions. In our 10-day residential program, we have to spend a lot of time on those first few days of actually analyzing our thoughts, because most people aren't used to doing this. They're just used to flying by their what we call NATs, negative automatic thoughts. And they just go with their gnats moment by moment, day by day, not analyzing them. Are those thoughts rational? Are they distorted? If they are distorted, in what way? How can we actually get to true and accurate thoughts? The second part of emotional intelligence is managing our emotions. People with low emotional intelligence are simply managed by their emotions. Moment by moment, day by day, they have powerful emotions, but they're being managed by those emotions. People with high emotional intelligence still have powerful emotions, but they're managing those emotions. Distinctly different. The third part of emotional intelligence is recognizing emotions in others. This is a crucial ingredient and one that comes with empathy. And empathy is a primary characteristic in regards to our emotional intelligence and also managing relationships with others. So emotional intelligence is not just about you, it's about others. And it's about your relationship with others and your ability to understand others and their emotions. And then the fifth aspect is motivating ourselves to achieve our goals. There are people that have high IQ, but they haven't done very well in life, and they've had a lot of problems. And a lot of times it's due to the fact that they haven't had the motivation. You know, even at, we also have a high school, Weimar Academy. We'll have kids with high IQ that don't get straight A's. In fact, they might be a long ways away from straight A's. What's the problem? It's their motivation. It's their emotional intelligence part. And of course, this is why it's important to try to teach emotional intelligence at the primary levels. You know, in our freshman class, it's a general education class for everyone at Weimar to take Optimize Your Brain, to know how to enhance their learning abilities and also to enhance their emotional abilities, because their success in life actually has more to do with their emotional intelligence than it does even their IQ, as important as both are. And you know, when you take a look at these 5 things, you can start seeing how important this is. Even the part managing our emotions. The most quoted researcher in all the world is from an institute that was represented yesterday in my meeting in Oakland, California. And at least U.S. News and World Report ranks this up there higher than Harvard University now. Anyone know what Ivy League school it's talking about on the West Coast? Stanford. And the most quoted researcher at Stanford is now the most quoted researcher in all the world. His name is Roy Baumeister. He actually teaches in the psychology department there. And he tells us the number one problem in all the world. And he makes an eloquent case. He's convinced me. The number one problem in all the world is not talked about by the Democrats. It's not talked about by the Republicans. It's not talked about by the president. It's not talked about even by religious leaders. One of the religious leaders considered the religious leader of the world, came to the United States and spoke to Congress and spoke to stadiums. Never once mentioned the number one problem. They'll mention problems, but these problems sink into insignificance compared to this problem that Roy Baumeister has identified as the number one problem in all the world. What is the number one problem in all the world? It's lack of comprehensive self-control. Lack of self-control. And we're never going to be able to have self-control unless we're able to manage our emotions. If we can't manage our emotions, we're going to be impulsive. We're going to have the lower brain take over. And lack of self-control is actually the number one cause of heart disease. Because we know how to even reverse heart disease in this country through nutrition and lifestyle. So why is heart disease still the number one killer in this country? It's not due to the heart per se, it's due to the mind. And it's due to the fact that people aren't incorporating in their lives what they know is healthy for them. Why? They don't have self-control. And so this is an important subject and one that we need to understand more about. In fact, in our 10-day program, we spend a lot of time on those last 3 days getting ready for re-entry, because re-entry is a dangerous time. Their brains are already starting to improve, but they've been given some nice accountability in regards to all the factors that are going to help their brain, but pretty soon they're going to be going back to their own homes and their own environment and their own families and their own work. And are they going to actually be doing the same things that led them to the need for our program? And so that self-control aspect is an important part, and one in regards to the ability to manage our emotions. So improving emotional intelligence, not surprisingly, has been shown in some nice controlled trials to prevent or treat depression, phobias, obsessive-compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, anorexia, bulimia, and even addictions such as alcoholism, or even the number one addiction in the United States today. Anyone want to know what the number one addiction is in the United States? It's technology addictions. And I tell you, the addiction to smartphones and screens, it is rampant, particularly in Generation Y and Z, but it can happen to the elderly generation as well. And a good section of the elderly are also addicted to their screens. And it actually has some biochemical major disadvantages. There's I'll talk a little bit more about that this afternoon, because I'm having a whole presentation on Optimize Your Brain on what it does brain chemistry-wise and what we can do about this. But improving emotional intelligence also helps normal people to think clearer, communicate more effectively. It fosters unity in group settings. It reduces polarizing statements. It promotes a happier life. And all of this is accomplished without compromise or sacrificing the truth. It turns out, just like in building a bridge or building an airplane, in building your own brain, truth matters. And truth is extremely important. A lot of people say, well, wait a minute, you talked about unity in group settings. That means we have to put differences aside. That means we have to get to the lowest common denominator. And that means we have to sacrifice truth in order to do that. No. If you sacrifice truth to get to unity, that's a very superficial unity that is going to explode when there's stress that comes into the situation. And so emotional intelligence, one of the bedrock principles, it has to be based on what is truthful and accurate. So the influences on emotional intelligence are many. Our genetic makeup has a role to play. And this is something we measure. When people come to our program, we leave no stone unturned. So we're actually identifying their genetics, not just the way a lot of genetics are identified in the typical psychiatrist's office, where they're just looking at liver genetics on what medicines are going to have the most side effects or interactions. But they're not actually looking at the primary genetic issues that are bringing about the depression and anxiety. And those tests we do, including the epigenetic test. We can see if the gene is there and if it's active. And the nice thing about a lot of genes is we can actually deactivate them through proper nutrition and lifestyle, and maybe taking a supplement or something along that nature, and we can measure it and the gene is no longer active. You have the bad gene, but it's having zero negative activity in regards to that brain. But genetic makeup does have a role to play. And so we look at that genetic makeup. One of the most common genetic issues we'll be discussing tomorrow morning. Actually, we'll discuss several of the common ones because we're going to be talking about nutrition in the brain. And a lot of this has to do with the nutritional aspect. And so you won't want to miss that. Those that have the calm exterior but tense interior that can be undermethylators. Those that have a high tendency for addictions. Those who have more learning disability issues, and then others who are highly sensitive to all sorts of situations. Normally they have high norepinephrine, low dopamine levels, and there are certain genetic issues that are bringing about this imbalance in the brain. So we don't want to underemphasize this. Genetic makeup can have a role to play, but it's never a sole role. And this is what we'll be demonstrating tomorrow. Childhood experiences have a role to play. By the way, childhood trauma, emotional trauma, do you think that's going up or going down in our society? It's going up considerably. What percent of young people today are raised by both biological parents at the same time, from 0 to 18? It's 20% now. 20%. And this is a key ingredient. There's a lot of studies. In fact, in our next Emotional Intelligence Summit, we hold one every year at Weimar. If you want to see what's happening to Weimar, you're all invited. It's the fourth weekend in February where we have our emotional, I think it's the fourth weekend. You'll have to look it up, eqsummit.org. It might be the third. But it's this next one, we are centering in on attachment disorders. Attachment disorders are at an all-time high because it used to be just a normal thing to attach very healthfully to mommy and daddy, and to have those attachments produce some sense of security and sense of well-being and a sense of love. That is uncommon today. That's uncommon. And then abuse is at an all-time high. 1 in 4 chance that even a male is going to be sexually abused by the time they're age 18. And it's as high as it is in, that's as high as it is in females. And it used to be lower in both by considerable amounts. And these things have significant scarring and different issues in the brain that we have to get at. And fortunately, neuroplasticity can change those brains for the better as well. So no matter what background you've had, one of the things we talk about, Harvard actually talks about this. Harvard, through their Mastery of Stress study, showed that if you don't have a good relationship with your mother and a good relationship, and you also don't have a good relationship with your father, 9 out of 10 chance you're going to be diagnosed with a major illness by the time you're 50. 90% chance you're going to have a major illness if you don't have a good relationship with both mom and dad. Now, if you have a good relationship with one or the other, it's a coin flip. It's improved to 50%. But if you have a good relationship with both, it's a stark minority. By the way, speaking of science in the Bible, honor thy what? Father and thy mother, that thy what? Days may be long. Harvard has proven that that's true. Science and religion goes hand in hand. But what we talk about is, what if you're in that category where you're only have a 10% chance of avoiding a major mental illness? Let's study that 10%. How did they not come down with a major mental illness? And you know, it has to do with the emotional principles of being able to get on the right program when you have attachment disorders and all of those sorts of things. And so you're not doomed. It's not 100%, praise God. But we can actually have, no matter what the background is, we can actually improve and actually be able to counteract the deficits that occurred at an early age because of our wonderful brains and their ability for neuroplasticity and for those brains to change. Our current level of emotional support has a significant role to play in our emotional intelligence. And then there are physical conditions. Even sleep. If you haven't slept for the last 24 or 48 hours, what do you think happens to your emotional intelligence? Does it go up or go down? It goes down considerably. Poor nutrition. Also, it's going to go down. What you eat does turn into neurotransmitters. It's very important in regards to your brain activity. Illness has a role to play. But for many, not for all, but for many, these factors are of less significance when compared to the next slide. What a major influence on emotional intelligence is for quite a few is our beliefs. Our emotions are largely controlled by our beliefs, our evaluation of events, the way we think about what? Problems, and our silent self-talk. These are the moment-by-moment messages we give ourselves. And this is why we have to get to the thoughts. Your feelings result from your thoughts. They result from the messages you give yourself, which is actually your thoughts. Your thoughts have much more to do with how you feel than what is actually happening in your life. And this is why we have stories like Paul and Silas. They were taken against their will. They were doing good to humanity, but they were beaten up for it. Their backs were laid open as they were beaten with rods. Then they were put on not a nice carpet floor like this. It was an irregular dirt floor with rocks and stones and those type of things in it. Their feet were put up in stocks. And there they were, crying uncontrollably in prison and saying, "Why us, Lord?" The first part of that story was true, but some of you have heard that story. What were they doing? They had happy looks on their faces, singing praises to God. Why is that the case? Because their thoughts had much more to do with how they were feeling than what was actually happening in their life. Now, they weren't thinking fantasy thoughts, like, I'm not here in prison, but I'm at a beach in San Diego. That would have worked for only 1.2 seconds at best, and reality would have come back to them. They were thinking true and accurate thoughts. But those true and accurate thoughts were so powerful that even under the most adverse situation that you could almost imagine, their emotions were managed, and they actually had happy looks on their faces, singing praises to God. So we're going to go through 3 stories, if we have time, maybe 4, of examples on emotional intelligence and challenges of such. The Bible tells us of a man who was not only tall, but the Bible says stunningly handsome. In fact, he was so handsome that people could just not avoid but look at him when he went by. He just was easy on the eyes. In addition, he was wealthy. And, having those 3, you might think, well, that encompasses like the Hollywood stars of the day, but he had even advantage over the Hollywood stars I went to medical school in Southern California and treated a lot of Hollywood stars, and I realized the vast majority of them are loved only by the people who don't know them. But once you get to know them, watch out. They can memorize their lines, they have the IQ, but they don't have the EQ. There's a reason why they have 7 divorces by the time they're age 35. But this guy, he was well liked by people who knew them. He was well liked by the general public. One of the reasons why he's had a sense of humility about him. And the Bible says Samuel, after Samuel met him, he spent about an hour with him, and he began to love him like his own son. Saul was just one of those great, likable people that had a sense of humility. In fact, he never would have run for king had there been the opportunity to run for king, because he didn't have that sense of pride. By the way, I should just mention something. Our founding fathers never wanted people to run for president. That's why they had the Electoral College. The electors were to get together and choose the wisest leader. George Washington was selected that way, and George said, "Hey, I'm not running. Please don't select me." And they said, "You're the best man for the job. Will you please do it?" "I don't want to do it." "Please. Our country's new. We know that you're the best man for the job." And he says, "I'll do it, but I'm not going to do it for more than 2 terms. You're going to have to find somebody else after that." And that was the sense of humility that was needed, to have people stand up and say, "I know what it takes to run this country well." You are self-selecting out a group of arrogant people. And arrogance does not always, it doesn't go with emotional intelligence the best. And so, but Saul wasn't that way, at least at first. And the Bible says the Lord anointed him to be the first king. A lot of people think, well, God was getting back at the Israelites since they wanted a king to begin with, by giving them Saul. No, he chose the best person for the job in Israel at that time. And he was a great king for a few years. But then he began to have particularly emotional problems. And research has documented that negative thoughts which cause emotional turmoil nearly always contain what? Gross distortions. The thoughts on the surface appear valid, but you will learn that they are irrational or just plain wrong. And what is it that causes a major cause of suffering? Twisted thinking. So in Saul's case, let's take a look at what the thoughts were behind it. There's 10 different ways of distorted thinking that have been outlined. This is one of the things we're going to be teaching. In fact, we teach this in our programs. Every one of our programs, we teach these 10 ways. And we have people see which ones they have a tendency to go towards. And we even help them develop flashcards. Their common negative thoughts, what the distortion is, and on the other side is their renewed thought. And so they'll go through these flashcards, and they'll do them every day so that they can actually get this ingrained in their mind, what is true and accurate thoughts. But this is a very common one. This is when we major in minors and minor in majors. And Saul, who was an intelligent man, began to do this. And one of the reasons why God didn't want a king to begin with is because of this principle that's encompassed in 2 words. Have you heard of this? Power corrupts. What does absolute power do? It corrupts absolutely. And he began to build up a sense of arrogance that he didn't have before. And when confronted with his own guilt, he began to justify himself, and he began to rationalize his mistakes. Confucius says a man who has committed a mistake and doesn't correct it is committing another mistake. And that another mistake is even worse than the first, because they're doomed to repeat it, because they're not learning from their mistakes. David Schwartz says, we can turn setbacks into victories. We need to recognize we're human beings. All of us are going to make mistakes at times. Find the lesson, apply it, and move on. Then look back on defeat and smile. My father used to say there are 2 types of people, those with 20 years experience and those with 1 year's experience 20 times over. And these are people that are actually not learning from their mistakes. They're not analyzing their thoughts. They're not necessarily seeing how they can grow differently. Ellen White says, if you have made mistakes, you certainly gain a what? Victory. If you what? See these mistakes and regard them as what? Beacons of warning. Thus you turn defeat into victory, disappointing the enemy and honoring your Redeemer. We can turn defeat into victory. We can gain a victory if we see our mistakes. Then he began to dwell on the unfairness of his life. And if you live long enough, every individual will be treated unfairly at times. We live in a world that is distorted. We live in a world that's not fair. And we need to be grateful for the times when we may be treated fairly. But to continue to dwell on the unfairness of life starts to develop these ruts in the brain. And then we get to the point where we can't stand things. In fact, this is one of the things we teach our participants the first night of the program. We actually teach them their first song. But did you know there's only one thing a human being cannot stand? That's death. Everything else they actually can stand. But when they tell themselves they can't stand it, that's when emotions get out of control. This is when we start magnifying things out of proportion. This is when rage starts to take over. This is when anger hits. And there's a little song we teach our guests. I don't like it, I don't like it, it's okay, I can stand it anyway, I can stand it anyway, I'm all right, I'm all right. And that song just teaches us just because we don't like something doesn't mean we can't stand it. And of course, it's important for them to learn that in their first hydrotherapy treatment. The hydrotherapy treatment that's going to help wake up their brain and have these positive effects. We have a lot of people who think they're not going to be able to stand the cold water because the cold water they're in is like the cold water off of Coos Bay, Oregon coast. But they're only in it for less than a minute, and then they're in a hot tub prior to that. But it's those contrast baths that actually help to wake up the brain, help to get some of those toxins out. And you know, it's amazing, these people that hated their hydrotherapy treatment in 10 days, they're trying on the last day of the program, because our last day of the program, they're gone at 10 a.m., and we're having to get them ready with their certificates and reentry and those sorts of things. And so we don't have hydro on the last day of the program. And they're trying to pay our hydrotherapists under the table for one more hydrotherapy treatment because they recognize how beneficial this has been for them. But Saul developed this I can't stand it-itis. And he began to have rage. And he began to have anger because he was magnifying things out of proportion. We're told when trials arise that seem unexplainable, we should not allow our peace to be spoiled. However unjustly we may be treated, let not passion arise. By indulging a spirit of retaliation, who do we injure? We injure ourselves. We destroy our own confidence in God and grieve the Holy Spirit. And the third aspect of Saul's thoughts had to do with this development. He was minimizing his own guilt while maximizing his own abilities. And he developed this high self-esteem. Now, the people didn't realize this was happening. They knew Saul as a humble man at first. But in one of the battles, David, it got very clear David was the all-star of the battle. And a battle that they should have lost, it appeared, but the Lord really blessed David, and David became the all-star of the battle, and the women were so happy to have their husbands and their brothers and everyone coming back, and that they were going to be safe. And so they had come up with this great song, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Now, I must admit, had I been the choir director that day and Saul's doctor, I would have advised them to change the lyrics. But they thought Saul was going to put his arm around David and say, aren't we glad God put him in a position to succeed? But the first time they sang it, he wasn't sure he heard it right. Second time, he did hear it right. and his inflated sense of self was then wounded. You know, often we get this wounded pride. These feelings of worthlessness always start out actually with an inflated sense of self that is wounded. And it wasn't just unique to Saul. Is not this great Babylon which I have built? Who was this? Did Nebuchadnezzar have emotional problems? Severe emotional problems. By the way, some have said that our current president is the Nebuchadnezzar of today. Nebuchadnezzar was an intelligent individual, and he had a lot of positive traits. I mean, Trump is so intelligent that he's more intelligent than the mass media, because they always think that they're beating him up just great until it comes election time, and they found out they haven't done their work in comparison to how Trump has done it. He actually is a master at manipulation and those sorts of things as well. And of course, the media is trying their best to manipulate as well. And that's why some people have also said every person who runs for president should come through our program first. But nonetheless, Nebuchadnezzar's problem was so severe, it took more than a 10-day program for him. How long was his program? A 7-year program. But the first thing God did was put him on a plant-based vegetarian diet. In fact, it was only the raw greens for him. Put him on an exercise program. You can't even eat unless you exercise, Nebuchadnezzar. And hydrotherapy was part of his treatment as well. Music therapy was part of his treatment. You can read chapter 4. Actually, it's an entire chapter that Nebuchadnezzar wrote about his program there in Daniel of the Bible. And did the program work? Yes. Nebuchadnezzar became an emotionally intelligent as well as a general intelligent king, and probably became one of the greatest kings ever after that time period. I will exalt myself above the Most High. Who was this? Lucifer. Inflated sense of self is how all this sin problem started. Now, one of the books that we recommend that people read, and we draw principles out of this book, is called Telling Yourself the Truth. It's a book by William Backus, a great clinical psychologist from Minneapolis, Minnesota. And he's also written another book that's just as important in some. It's called What Your Counselor Never Told You. And the subtitle of it is The 7 Sins That Lead to Mental Illness. And the first sin that he mentions that leads to mental illness is the sin of pride. And then he gives you a little test to see whether you might have it. Trying to be noticed. Craving attention. By the way, have you wondered why the tattoo industry has exploded in our country? Trying to be noticed. Craving attention. Itching for compliments. Needing to be important. Detesting the idea of being submissive. Loathing the idea of admitting to wrongdoing, strongly opinionated, being argumentative, demanding your way, wanting control over others, flaunting your individual rights, refusing advice, being critical yet resenting any criticism coming your way, being oversensitive, and finally, thinking you have excellences you actually don't even have. William Backus says, watch out. If you have one or more than one of these, pride is there, and wounded pride is coming your way. You are magnifying self. In contrast, we have another case, Christ, who was never elated by applause, we're told. By the way, the reason why he was never elated by applause, maybe he should have been allowed to develop an arrogant sense of self. After all, the Bible says he was the creator of the world. But yet, despite being the creator, he not only said the words, he lived the words. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the poor in spirit. So he was never elated by applause because he never developed this arrogant sense of self, nor was he dejected by censure or disappointment. And those two are connected. if we're not going to be elated by applause, we're not going to get down when we're dejected and disappointed. In fact, we're told amid the greatest opposition, there was no one more opposed in this world. And the most cruel treatment, he was still of what? Still of good courage, and even looking for a soul to save with his crucifixion. Nothing gives one person so much advantage over another as to remain cool and unruffled under all circumstances. By the way, I was just at his monument on Thursday before I went to Oakland, California. Does anyone know who's the author of that statement? It was the founder of the Democratic Party. Who was the founder of the Democratic Party? Thomas Jefferson. And by the way, Thomas Jefferson in his monument, I didn't realize this. I visited at night. And at night, Thomas Jefferson's memorial there, he's sitting, and of course his Declaration of Independence that he wrote, and a lot of his words, religious freedom. When he died, on his epitaph, he didn't want to have anything said that he was president, but he wanted to be known for religious freedom. And by the way, this is an erosion that is strongly taking place in our society today. The powers that be are attacking religious freedom on a major level, and nobody's identifying it as such. And Thomas Jefferson, if we would read him, we would clearly understand how religious freedom is under assault today. And when I got out of the monument there, it's quite a ways away, but at night, when you walk out of Thomas Jefferson's monument, you can clearly see the White House. And I looked at that up afterwards, and if you look out the window of the White House, you can actually see not only the memorial of Thomas Jefferson, you can actually see him. And he's a little bit higher. In other words, he's overlooking, are you fulfilling the Bill of Rights? Are you standing up for this? But Jefferson also knew about emotional intelligence, and he was right about this. Nothing gives one person so much advantage over another. But you'll never be able to have that advantage unless you get rid of I can't standarditis and get rid of this arrogance of self. Well, when Paul underwent the recommended therapy for depression, he would feel better again. What was his recommended therapy? Music therapy. By the way, that's been well studied. We're going to talk about that a little bit this afternoon, how we can optimize our brain through music therapy. And his brain, his frontal lobe would get enhanced. He'd be able to control his emotions again. But in time, unfortunately, he would never correct his distorted thoughts for more than a few days. He would correct them. At times, even his music therapist became his clinical counselor. And he'd say, David, you're right. In fact, it became so dangerous for him to counsel because he tried to kill his counselor a couple of times. By the way, one of our spiritual counselors in our program, he's a great spiritual counselor. I'm deviating a little bit, but it's a great story. He, at age 15, attempted to murder his counselor. And he was put in prison for 20 years as a juvenile. And he knew nothing about the Bible. But someone sent him a Bible, and he began to read the Bible for the first time to try to show that it was wrong, because he had always heard the Bible was wrong. So he was going to try to disprove the Bible, but and never reading it for the first time, he came across the story of Saul, who tried to kill his counselor. And he said, how's that going to turn out for him? I tried to do that. And here's this story. In fact, he said the Bible became inherently true to him because the heroes of the Bible also had bad things said about them in regards to what they did, because the Bible is transparent. It doesn't cover up anything. And he said the biographies of today, they're going to cover up things. They're going to be biased. But he recognized he was reading a true book. And by reading the Bible, he became converted. And when he went out of prison, he is actually now a counselor and an evangelist, and he comes and actually spiritual counsel. He's one of the greatest counselors we have. He's written a book as well about his life that's very important. His name is Wyatt Allen, if you want to look him up. But in time, with the three causes still active and the third cause becoming even more prominent, he would slip back into anxiety and depression. And then, with his life under tremendous stress, when he felt like he needed direction, and he prayed to the Lord for direction, and the Lord was not answering him the way Saul said he should. By the way, beware of telling God to answer you the way you state he should. If he doesn't answer you, like he didn't answer Saul, it's normally because he's already answered you, and you haven't been following the counsel. And in Saul's case, when he didn't get an answer the way he thought he should, he then went to the wrong counselor, and beware of that. The wrong counselor told him 90% truth, told him all the things he had messed up on, but he told him something that was absolutely false. And that was, there is no hope for you, Saul. You have messed up so bad. By the way, that's a temptation he gives a lot of people that have mental, emotional problems. You've messed up so bad, there's no way your brain's ever going to go back to being a healthy brain. It'll never be able to be healthy. You've messed up so bad, you just have to give up. And so Saul, the next day, under tremendous stress, he gave up. And he ended his own life. An unnecessary death had he not taken care of the underlying situations. And on even that night, there was hope for Saul if he would have turned towards it. The second case is emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning is that your feelings don't lie. And this was a very common one as well. Emotional reasoning. Let me give you some examples. I feel overwhelmed and helpless, therefore my problems are impossible to solve. Is that true? Because I feel overwhelmed and helpless, my problems are impossible to solve? No, but for an emotional reasoner, it's true, because the only evidence they need is their feelings. I feel angry at you, and that proves that you've been cruel and insensitive to me. Does that prove that, because I feel angry at you? No. But for an emotional reasoner, that's all the proof they need, because their feelings don't lie. And emotional reasoning can go the other way as well. I feel on top of the world, therefore I am invincible. And it can even get to, I feel that I am a woman, therefore I am a woman. Now, it might be true if you feel like you're a woman, you are a woman. But we have to look for evidence. The whole aspect of things is looking for evidence to look at things from an objective standpoint in regards to what you actually are. And this is a common distortion, and it's one that another great individual in the Bible experienced. He was high IQ. He said in my heart, go to now, I'll prove thee with mirth, therefore enjoy pleasure. Whatever was fun, he wanted to do. If he saw someone else having fun, he wanted to do it. And so he got into the drugs of the day, he got into alcohol, he got into the opium of the day. And then he got into this. Whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy. What is it that his eyes should have been kept from? Where did it lead him to? Therefore I hated life for all its vanity and vexation of spirit. Therefore I went about to cause my heart to despair. In Saul's case, in Solomon's case, it was women. One woman was not enough. 2 women were not enough. 5 women were not enough. 300 wives were not enough. 700 concubines were not enough. And there were some very adverse brain changes taking place. This book written about him said, many envied the popularity and abundant glory of Solomon, thinking that of all men he must be the most happy. People would look at him and think, he has it all together. He's got the most beautiful palaces, the most beautiful lawns. He's got servants at his beck and call. He's got a woman that is the most beautiful woman from every ethnicity known to mankind at his beck and call. He's got to be the most happy. But amid all that glory of artificial display, the man envied should be the one what? most pitied. His countenance is dark with despair. All the splendor about him is but a mockery of the distress and anguish of his thoughts as he reviews his misspent life in seeking for happiness through the indulgence and selfish gratification of every desire. By his own bitter experience, Solomon learned the emptiness of a life that seeks in earthly things its highest good. Gloomy and soul-harassing thoughts troubled him night and day. For him, there was no longer any joy of life or peace of mind, and the future was dark with despair. What was he suffering from? Severe major depression. When the future looks dark with despair, that's one of the hallmarks of significant depression. And Solomon was into the false ways of altering the way you feel. These ways are based, there are some principles behind these false ways, and that is you can never get enough of what you don't need. He thought if he just had another woman from another ethnicity, that he would finally find fulfillment and wouldn't want any more. But you can never get enough of what you don't need. And why is that? Because what you don't need will never satisfy you. There have been studies, randomized controlled trials on pornography that can't be conducted today, by the way. The researchers are saying we can't do these randomized trials anymore because we can't find enough people that have not been exposed to it. But back before the internet came about, they actually did a study of 300 men and women that were randomized to look at regular movies or magazines or pornographic ones, and within 6 weeks, major differences started to emerge. They became less interested and less attracted to their partner. They became more self-absorbed if they were in pornography, less empathy for others around them, diminished ability to foresee consequences, and began to shut down emotionally. Now we know why this is taking place. The studies show that if you are having excess sex, or if you are having sex not by design, this would be what the researchers call superstimulatory sex or masturbation, there are brain changes that take place in the brain that are adverse. Dopamine and dopamine 2 receptors start to decline, and so you're looking for pleasure, but more pleasure actually leads to what? Less pleasure. And you get less and less pleasure, and your dopamine levels are way down in the basement the vast majority of the time, and then you do your false way of altering the way you feel just to get up to neutral again. First, you did it to get high, but pretty soon it's just to get neutral. And the ones who aren't doing this, their dopamine levels are above neutral all the time. Just going on a beautiful outdoor walk, and their dopamine levels go up very high, and they're experiencing a lot of satisfaction and enjoyment from life, but people that are in this lifestyle can't experience that enjoyment anymore. Another change that takes place is their limbic system is rewired, and the amygdala becomes more powerful. This is where your emotional experiences are stored. And so that first time effect, you continue to try to get that because it's stored in the amygdala, and the limbic system starts to easily override the frontal lobe. And then, on top of that, hypofrontality occurs. We will actually see the activity and the shrinking of the gray matter occurring. Hypofrontality sets in, which means willpower erodes, and that means self-control, unless this is changed, is almost an impossibility. Dr. Zillman says the negative effects of pornography and or masturbation on emotional intelligence are more consistently proven than the links between smoking and lung cancer. More consistently proven. But yet society today ignores this, and they actually encourage the very habits that are going to cause a significant decline in emotional intelligence in humanity. Research in the last couple of decades have shown that one of the primary characteristics of virtually every depressed or anxious individual is a suppression in the frontal lobe of the brain. This is a SPECT scan of someone who's come to our program with depression. This is post-recovery from depression after the 10-day point, and notice this marked difference in the frontal lobe activity. The frontal lobe is there in the top, and you're even seeing those red colors as the frontal lobe begins to wake up. By the way, in regards to the sexual things that suppress the frontal lobe, it takes 90 days for a reboot. We call it no PMO, no pornography, no masturbation, no orgasm for 90 days. And then the brain starts to wake up. And major positive changes start to occur in the brain with the dopamine receptors and all of those positive things. James says no one should say God tempts, because God doesn't tempt anyone. Each one is tempted when he is dragged away and enticed by his own what? Evil feelings. And the problem is feelings can lie. That's why we need to elevate them to our frontal lobe. Jonathan Martin says feelings are much like waves. We can't stop them from coming, but we can choose which one to surf. How do we choose? The one that's based on what is true and accurate. And then Thomas Jefferson says something profound here as well. He says, don't bite at the bait of pleasure until you are sure there is no hook beneath. Can you imagine how many problems would be solved in our society if people would not bite at the bait of pleasure until they were sure there was no hook beneath? Just a couple of things here. Solomon turned his life around. A prophet came to him, and he began to analyze what had gone wrong, and the prophet says the kingdom's going to be taken away from you, and he began to self-diagnose his own issues that had led him to that point. And if Solomon turned his life around, there is hope for any individual here to turn their life around. Your brain can positively change. And by the way, that's why Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes. He wrote that to warn every young person to not go the route that he did in regards to managing your emotions. So case number 3, he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree and requested that he might what? Die, and said, it is enough, O Lord, take away my... Who is it that wanted to die prematurely? It was Elijah. Now, was Elijah like Saul, where he had developed an inflated sense of self? No. He didn't have the narcissistic personality disorder. Nor was he like Solomon, where he was out there just trying to do fun things. Elijah was a good man, a righteous man. And even good and righteous people can fall into emotional problems. He began to suffer from depression so bad he wanted to die. And in fact, God had to put him on a depression recovery program. Angels came and fed him a meal. I think there was some flaxseed in that meal. He had to get him out of the cave and get him exercising. He had to expose him to light therapy. Get out of the dark. You need the light, Elijah. And then he finally came and gave him cognitive behavioral therapy, and he asked him this 4-word question: how did you get here? These are questions we ask every one of the individuals. What has been going on in your life? And Elijah began to talk. And he began to tell some things. And the first time he said some things, the counselor let him get by with it. Same thing we do in our program. They're just talking, and we develop that whole picture. But the second time he said it, the Lord stopped him and said, you're wrong. What was he wrong about? He was overgeneralizing. Overgeneralization is holding the hypothesis as a fact rather than a hypothesis, or generalizing from too few instances. What it precisely is using limited factual evidence. Using limited factual evidence. I don't have this definition up there. I thought I did. Using limited factual evidence to hold a firm belief that actually is not true. And so you're using some evidence, but you're overgeneralizing. What was Elijah's overgeneralization? I'm the only one. How could he have stated that more accurately? Maybe I'm the only one I know of? But instead, he just knew he was the only one. And God had to tell him, you're not the only one. In fact, you're wrong by a factor of what? You're not just a little bit wrong, you're a lot wrong. 7,000. And then he told him to do 3 things that Elijah didn't want to do. And that often occurs in our program as well. Normally, people want to do everything in our program except for 3 things, but it's always a different 3 things For some, they love hydrotherapy the first time. They're totally on board. In fact, most do love hydrotherapy the first time. And for some, they love the exercise. And for some, they love the diet. But then there's always something that they're saying, I'm doing this here, but I'm not doing this at home. And actually, our studies show how well they do a year later is dependent on the three things that they didn't want to do, whether they're still doing them or not. And Elijah didn't want to do those things. I'm not going to go into it because of time considerations, but then he said, it's coming from an expert. I don't know why he's telling me to do this, but I think I better listen to it. And he did those three things, and did he get better? He got better, he established the school of the prophets, and he was translated without seeing death. What does that tell us? That tells us that God has tremendous sympathy and compassion for those that have emotional problems. Because the person that was translated without seeing death was so depressed, they wanted to die. But yet that's who our forerunner is in heaven. Father in heaven, we thank you that you have created us with minds that can change. We understand that the culture and times of our day are designed really by the evil one to make them change for the worse. But we also pray that by following your principles of truth and your science and your thoughts and words, that our brains can be transformed and renewed. And we thank you that through our ability to think true and accurate thoughts, we can manage our emotions and have a powerful influence in helping others towards the path that leads to fulfillment and happiness and joy. We now pray that if there's anyone here who recognizes that they may have been thinking negative automatic thoughts without realizing it, recognizing that they might be experiencing emotional reasoning or magnification or minimization or overgeneralization. And they want to say, Lord, I want to quit this distorted, negative way of thinking. And I want to be transformed by the renewing of my mind to think true and rational thoughts. Just notify God at this time of your desire to do this and raise your hand to him now. Lord, you see the hands that are made, the commitments that have been made, that we might analyze our thoughts, correct those thoughts, and live our life according to true and accurate thoughts. And we thank you for your promise that you will indeed make us free. In Jesus' name we pray.